You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Well, today I'm going to break the liturgical rules. I'm going to jump tracks over to Luke's version of this passage, Luke 10:25-37. In it, Jesus goes on to answer the question, who is my neighbor? With the parable of the Good Samaritan, a member of a group detested by Jews who takes care of a Jewish man lying beaten on the road after a priest and a Levite, both Jewish religious figures, give the man no help at all. Clearly, a neighbor is one who is kind to other people, regardless of their ethnic difference. As followers of Jesus, we are to see ourselves as neighbors to people we may not identify with racially, religiously, culturally, etc. All of this makes me think of the wars now erupting around the world, which ones we pay attention to, which ones we don't. Take, for example, the civil war raging in Sudan. As recently as this past week, the UN Undersecretary General referred to the violence there as one of the worst humanitarian nightmares in recent history, killing at least 9,000 and displacing some 5.6 million more in 6 months. Yet in the media I consume, the wars in Ukraine and in Israel-Palestine absorb vastly more attention. There are geopolitical reasons for this, of course, but there's also a kind of racial tribalism that registers white people, their lives, and their nations as more worthy of concern than others. We Americans perceive Europe and Russia, and to some degree Israel, settled and run largely by European Jews on Western democratic principles, as being our neighbor in a way that Sudan or Syria or Myanmar are not. None of what I'm saying here is original. Neither, by the way, is Jesus's distillation of all the law and the prophets down to the commandments to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. Other Jewish sages of his day said much the same thing, including the great Rabbi Hillel, who preceded Jesus by a generation. But I mentioned Sudan for the same reason that Jesus summarizes Jewish teaching in this way, not because it's new, but because it reminds us of who we are, God's children, called to view God's other children, near and far, black, brown, beige, and pink, as our neighbors. I mentioned Sudan for another reason as well. A couple of weeks into the current conflict there, the New York Times published a story about two Sudanese university students in the capital city of Khartoum, aged 25 and 23 respectively, and in their final year of mechanical engineering. Hassan Tibwa and Sami Al-Ghada were sheltering together in their apartment as gunfire and explosions rattled the streets. Then they got a call from someone who knew that they ran a taxi service as their side hustle. The person asked if they could rescue a senior UN official who was stuck in her house in a battle zone, was losing cell phone power, and had recently run out of water. So these two guys navigated their Toyota sedan down debris-filled streets, past burnt-out vehicles and buildings riddled with bullet holes, and through checkpoints manned by jumpy soldiers, When they arrived 4 miles and 1 hour later, they had to disguise the UN official in a long robe and invent a cover story that she was going into labor. After a prayer and a gauntlet of 10 more checkpoints, they dropped her off safe at a hotel. But that was only the beginning. The Times reported that over the next week, this is a quote, as the war surged between two feuding military factions, the students helped at least 60 people. South African teachers, Rwandan diplomats, Russian aid workers, and UN workers from many countries, including Kenya, Zimbabwe, Sweden, and the United States. 10 passengers said the students had swooped to their aid at terrifying, life-threatening moments when large organizations with drivers and security guards were nowhere to be found. Along the way, Tibwa and Algada were robbed, handcuffed, and threatened with execution. Fighters accused them of being spies. Shellfire and stray bullets fell around their car. And as if that weren't enough, every rescuee interviewed said the students had not asked for payment. Who did these two young men put their lives in jeopardy to save? Family members? Fellow students? Locals? No. Like the Good Samaritan who spends his own time and money to help the Jewish victim, they viewed any person in danger, whether Russian, Zimbabwean, South African, or Swede, as worthy of help. Now, the article doesn't mention their religion, and to me, it really doesn't matter. These two young men lived out Jesus' teaching to love your neighbor with Jesus' understanding of a neighborhood as the entire human community. Now, Mr. Rogers, who was an ordained minister, used to sing a song at the beginning of each show in which he'd ask his audience, "Won't you be my neighbor?" The scriptural echo in this invitation, as in the show's title, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, was not a coincidence. When terrible events took place in the news, Rogers also used to counsel children to look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. It's good advice for us all, as the world seems to sometimes be crumbling into smoke. Look for the helpers. Look for the Hassan Tibwas and the Sami Algadas of the earth. Look for the people willing to love their neighbors, not just their actual neighbors, but also the strangers in their land, the people from countries whose own media may barely be paying attention to the trauma they're suffering. Look for them, dashing down the stairwell of their apartment building as the walls tremble with explosions, weaving their dusty, dented sedan over bullet casings and past chunks of concrete toward the first of numerous roadblocks watched over by packs of men who press rifle muzzles against their heads and shout questions, but who cannot shake from their hearts the conviction that anyone in need, anyone at all, is in fact their neighbor whom they are called to love. Amen.